This semester, I'm very happy to welcome Greta La Fleur, from Associate Professor of American Studies at Yale University. Greta is also JD from the University of Connecticut. Greta is an incredibly accomplished scholar who has published a monograph, The Natural History of Sexuality in Early America, available in paperback now through Johns Hopkins Press. And she's also edited multiple volumes of really kind of important work in specific subject areas. The first being in trans studies, the volume Transhistorical, Gender Plurality Before the Modern, which was co-edited with Masha Raskolnikov and Anna Klosowska, as well as American Literature in Transition, the long 19th century from 1770 to 1828, co-edited with William Hunting Howell. And Greta is also at work on several book projects. This is one of them. And one is on, what is this one called? I can't even remember which. It's on feminist politics. I know that.
Yeah.
20th century. I know this because I think that one of the reasons that I brought Greta here to USC is because Greta is such a well-rounded, fully engaged scholar with peers, not just in official spaces, but also in unofficial spaces, willing to talk about, share work, truly engage and be present with other people's work, etc. So please welcome Greta La Fleur, and I'm going to introduce Sarah Kessler in a moment after you welcome.
Thanks, everybody.
And Sarah Kessler is an assistant professor of English and comparative literature here at USC, of course, a member of the Consortium. She is the TV editor of TV section editor of Public Books. Sarah also has multiple books in the works. The first being one on binge watching and affective binge watching, as well as another book on ventriloquism. But before becoming an academic, Sarah's had a rich publication life, and also while being an academic in art criticism, film and media criticism, and also doing curatorial work, etc. Both of them, both Sarah and Greta, are also nature enthusiasts and lovers of birds and birding.
And we're both Leos.
And
Yeah.
so my watching the introduction probably isn't in any case, thank you all for being here, and welcome to Greta and Sarah. We will begin with a 20-minute presentation from Greta before the conversation begins between her and Sarah. So
Awesome.
Please welcome the whole gang, and thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks so much to Karen for that introduction, to Sarah for being willing to be the interlocutor and the moderator for the conversation that'll follow. It's going to be a little longer. It's going to be about 25 minutes, if that's okay. I'm very verbose, as also a Leo, and I typically go over. But it should be right around 25 minutes because I practiced it earlier today. So I'm really happy to be here today and honored to have been named the USC Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture Fall 2023 Public Scholar in Residence. Before I begin, I want to thank about a dozen people who made this visit possible. And first and foremost, to Karen Tongson, to Elliot Dunn, Artemisa Clark, Nude St. Cyr, thank you so much for all this help with the setup in particular, Sarah Kessler, and to all of you coming today. The structure of today's event is that I'm going to offer a brief reading from this book project that is in progress. It's under contract with Duke University Press's Practices series. So the series, just to give you a sort of situated view here, it comprises a range of short books, all collections of essays on a particular practice. So the ones that are out so far are Running by Lindsay Freeman, Raving by Mackenzie Warwick, Fly Fishing by Christopher Schaberg, and Juggling by Stuart Lawrence Sinclair. So this book will be Birding, and it's co-authored by myself and my longtime friend and colleague Cal Brink, an associate professor of anthropology at McMaster University and a very enthusiastic naturalist. Cal refers to themselves as Grandpa Cal and likes to refer to their hobbies as all able to be collected under the sort of umbrella of retirement hobbies. So they make soap, they watch birds, they they work at their local botanical society, but they love nature things. So the book is made up of a series of 8 short essays about the various politics of birding and other naturalist practices, with special attention to the racial and sexual politics that came into stark relief following what people call the Central Park birding incident on May 25th, 2020. And for any of you who don't know what that was, I'll talk about it extensively in the beginning of this essay, so I will lay it out for you. But I'm assuming many of you know what it was. And what I'm reading from today is a section of one of my essays. So Cal and I are splitting it basically 50-50, tentatively titled "Nobody Owns the Park." And I do want to note that this is still very much a work in progress. So the final manuscript is due in a little over a month. So if you have suggestions for ways to revise or things to include, I'm really open to hearing them and excited to hear them. Okay, I'm just going to set myself up here so any digressions don't go over. Okay. Oops, let me just make sure I can switch my slides. Here we go. On May 25th, 2020, two Coopers met in a wood, or to be more specific, a ramble. The first Cooper was Christian Cooper, a then 57-year-old science writer and comic book writer and editor. Christian Cooper is Black and a nearly lifelong birder, having started birding as a 9-year-old in his hometown on Long Island. Cooper was a well-known figure to the New York birding community. In 2020, he sat on the board of directors for the New York City Audubon Society. And on May 25th, 2020 in particular, he was doing what any birder on the East Coast of the United States wants to be doing on a spring morning, walking around the Ramble, a particularly densely wooded section of Central Park, looking for migrants. The migrants he was seeking out on that day, however, were birds, migrating birds. Central Park falls squarely within an interhemispheric artery of wind and air that birders call the Atlantic Flyway, or sometimes just the East Coast Flyway, two names that I just love. The East Coast Flyway runs north-south from Greenland on the northernmost tip to the Caribbean and South America on the southernmost end. And a flyway is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a highway for migrating birds, the Interstate 95, if you will, of summer and fall migration. To really understand what has come to be known as the Central Park birdwatching incident, it's important to appreciate how exciting May as a month is for birders. May is the peak of spring migration, a seasonal experience whose importance I would place somewhere between that of March Madness for basketball fans and the World Cup for soccer fans. Every spring, between 4 and 5 billion birds fly north from their respective winter homes to make hundreds of new nests, breed, and in the next autumn to return south. For birders, this is exciting for a number of reasons. First, one just sees a lot more birds during the migration seasons. To illustrate this point, consider that when I go out bird watching, I use eBird, an app developed by Cornell Ornithology and discussed at length, by the way, in another chapter of the book, to log my bird and species counts. And during migration in particular, I generally go out birding every day. When I'm in New Haven, which is where I live, where I usually am during the week, I do a 2-mile loop around Edgewood Park, a beautiful, if somewhat rundown park with an entrance about a quarter of a mile from my house. Prior to the start of spring migration, my counts tend to sit around 20 species of birds, a list comprised of the typical raptors and non-migratory birds that tend to stick around New England all winter. Some of the birds I'll see in this time of year include robins, cardinals, red-tailed hawks, chickadees, and so on. Once migration starts, my species counts tend to get bigger and bigger, often day to day. Where in early April, I might see 20 or so species of birds on my morning walks. By late April, I'm seeing 35 to 40. By mid-May, if I'm really taking the time to move slowly, because bird watching is slow, and unfortunately I do have a job, I'm often seeing 50 or more species if I'm really watching and waiting. On May 14th, 2021, I did a 4-hour bird walk in Central Park. It was sponsored by the Wild Bird Fund, an urban wildlife rehabilitation organization that cares for injured birds found in the 5 boroughs in New York City, that took us, among other places, deep into the Ramble. That walk, conducted through a heavily trafficked section of the East Coast Flyway during peak spring migration, was, to this day, the best day of my birding life thus far. We saw more than 70 species of warblers alone and more than 100 species of birds total. That day was just under a year after the Central Park birding incident. I imagine, although I've never spoken to Christian Cooper about this, although we were actually trying to interview him for the book, I imagine that before his encounter with the other Cooper, Amy Cooper, that he had been having one of the better birdwatching mornings of 2020 thus far. What makes spring migration even more excellent is the fact that birds are also in their breeding plumage, meaning that they have the brightest and most ostentatious forms of themselves. The scarlet on adult male scarlet tanagers is a hue that one can generally only find in the lipstick of women over 75 or children's Halloween costumes. My girlfriend still teases me about the moment during that wild bird fun walk in Central Park when I saw a scarlet tanager high in a tree. Tanager is like the upper canopy. And I screamed like a straight teenage Beatles fan seeing Ringo Starr walk onto stage for the first time. Tanager! Like a mix of excitement and panic. It really just seems impossible to me that a bird of that color could have emerged purely from the organic world. Similarly, the painted bunting, a bird that appears in flocks hundreds deep in Texas and the deeper Midwest for most of the year, seems like something that could have only been invented or illustrated by Disney or Pixar, at least when it appears in the United States. Finally, probably the most exciting part of both the spring and fall migrations is the fact that one sees birds that don't belong to our individual regions. So birding is a very regional hobby. While one can bird anywhere, sorry, I just lost my place. When one takes themselves out of their normal stomping grounds, one sometimes finds themselves disoriented in a new biome, a new ecology, and a new set of common species. This can even be true within the same region, but across different habitats. For example, I personally prefer to bird in boreal forest because of the species that one finds there. I'm like a total basic warbler fan. But if I drive from Edgewood Park or East Rock Park to my most regular birding spots, just 2 miles away to Silver Sands or Lighthouse Park on the shores of the Long Island Sound, I find myself confronted with an almost entirely distinct ecology of birds. The yellow warblers I might have seen or heard many of in Edgewood Park are nowhere to be found. And instead, waterfowl, so oyster catchers, egrets, osprey, ruddy turnstones, plovers, multiple kinds of herons, what seem like dozens of distinct species of sandpipers and gulls, are what I find myself observing and trying to identify. Put another way, during migration, you see a lot of birds that aren't supposed to be there. And because so many birders prize their species counts, these are counts of how many species of birds you've seen in a year, a region, a lifetime, the migration seasons are great opportunities to find what birders call lifers, species that they are observing for the first time. You could think of bird watching in a birding hotspot during spring migration as something like walking through a major international airport, LAX, Heathrow, Singapore. You see species of birds that neither live nor spend time in your region as they're on their way to their actual summer or winter homes. The process of migration not only brings birds together that would generally not cross paths, but brings species to regions where they do not generally reside as well. This is the context I want to start with in this discussion of the Central Park birding incident, which represents, for almost everyone I know, literally the only thing any of them know about birding. So when you think about Christian Cooper, and again, we're back to Christian Cooper, think of him not only as a noted science writer and birder, but think of the situation too. The peak of migration in one of the best urban birding spots on the East Coast. The last time I birded in the Ramble, I saw one of the 2 Blackburnian warblers I've ever seen. I saw an indigo bunting, which, while not especially rare, are in my opinion especially spectacular with their bright blue plumage, and my first ever Canada warbler. All the worse in that situation to have all of the eligible local passerines scared off by an off-leash dog. Now we'll hop over. And that dog belonged to the other Cooper at the center of the incident, Amy Cooper, who is sometimes also referred to as the Central Park Karen. And sorry to Karen Thompson. Amy Cooper was, at the time, an investment banker who was walking her adopted Cocker Spaniel in the Ramble on the morning of May 25th, 2020, where she encountered Christian Cooper, to whom she's also not related. We know the rest of the story. Christian Cooper asked her to leash her dog in accordance with the rules of the Central Park Conservancy, which are posted all over the park. Amy Cooper refused, and in response, Christian Cooper offered her dog a treat, a tactic, in his account, intended to both draw in the dog such that it wasn't like zipping in and out of the brush, scaring off potential worm-eating warblers or other birds that dwell in the lower canopy, and also to scare the owner a bit, to trigger the owner's sense of protectiveness and danger, such that they capitulated to leashing their dog. The offer of the treat was what putatively provoked, a word I'm using with a deep sense of irony, Amy Cooper's phone call to 911, claiming, among other things, that a black man was threatening her life in the park. Christian Cooper recorded the entire encounter on his phone, which he later sent to his sister, who then posted it on Twitter, the first step in the encounter's transformation into an event of international notoriety that it quickly became. May 25th, 2020 was also the day that George Floyd was murdered by police, and together the 2 events constituted a devastating renewal to national and global conversations about anti-Blackness and racist policing. I should add that this incident, although I don't actually like to call it an incident because the word seems too close of a cousin to incidental, the idea that the racism at the center of the conflict between Christian and Amy Cooper was some sort of offhand, tertiary, epiphenomenal thing, when it actually provided the structuring conditions of the encounter. This was made by anti-Blackness. This is, of course, in no way exceptional, but it was definitionally central. Really, the only thing exceptional about the clash of the Coopers is that, to this day, Amy Cooper is one of the only white people we've seen who's experienced actual material consequences pursuant to what amounts to her untrammeled racist aggression, directed at someone who, which we know from the video, was following the rules of the park and asking her to do the same. She lost her job, she was charged with the criminal offense of filing a fake police report, and she had her dog taken away, although it was eventually returned to her. In many ways, the Central Park birding incident tells a story about race and the entitlement to public space, or rather about who can claim a legitimate entitlement to public space. Oops, sorry, that was we're just here at Amy Cooper still. But as a birder and a dog owner, here we go. Here's Chestnut Hero Central Park. I have a 14-year-old dog that an ex once referred to as a coffee table dog, long body, short legs. Another element of the Central Park birding incident stood out to me, which would have been more obvious if both Coopers were white or both Coopers were black. Who and to what is Central Park or any park for? The Ramble is at once what the Cornell Lab of Ornithology calls an eBird hotspot and a very important bird area where we should all respect the VIBs. But that dog walking is at least as central to the mission of Central Park will be obvious to anyone who has seen more than one movie set in New York City. So for example, Chestnut, Hero, Central Park. This is just a random photo of the park from the New York Times, but I did think the title was telling. And then this is a photo or a statue of Balto, who was one of the dogs that was used to find people in the rubble after 9/11, which is like at the opening to the park. So in nearly every representation of Central Park you can find, from Law & Order SVU to Todd Haynes' Carol, at some point features a dog being walked around in the background, or sometimes in the foreground, to create a kind of canine effet de réel. Beyond its iconicity as a visual synecdoche for New York City as a whole, dog walking, or Central Park and dog walking in Central Park, dog walking is also, at least in part, understood by the Central Park Conservancy itself to be definitional to the park's purpose. So from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. every day, and from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. every day, you can walk your dog in Central Park off-leash. The Ramble does not have off-leash hours precisely because of its status as a VIB area, but the Ramble constitutes only 36 of Central Park's massive 843 acres, and the Central Park Conservancy has explicitly provided that dogs may be walked in that area as long as they are leashed. I want to be clear that this is in no way a defense of Amy Cooper, whose clearly strategic instrumentalization of anti-Blackness in her aggression towards Christian Cooper was reprehensible. But the Ramble in particular is a section of the park that has historically drawn communities seeking to use it for many different and at times clashing purposes, and birding and dog walking are just two of them. The Ramble, at least among queer and trans people of a certain age, is far better known for its status as a long-standing cruising area, where gay men and sex workers, which are of course not mutually exclusive categories, have gathered for at least 100 years to find each other and have sex. In the face of the widespread criminalization of homosexuality in the form of anti-sodomy laws, which remained good law in New York State until 1980, gathering with other queer people, and I mean queer capaciously here in a way that encompasses cis gay men and women, as well as trans people of any sexual orientation or gender. And if you have questions about why I'm talking about it this way, please ask me in the Q&A. This was risky business. And we know this story. The Stonewall riots of 1969, and here's just another cruising image. I love some of these photos. I just lost my place again, I'm so sorry. The Stonewall riots of 1969, which were ignited at the end of a string of NYPD raids on the Stonewall Inn, a bar frequented by queer and trans people in Greenwich Village, transpired in part because of the decades of very well-documented police violence that attended these raids, wherein queer and trans people would be hauled to jail and frequently beaten and or sexually assaulted, often by police themselves. When I teach the histories of LGBT liberation movements in the United States to my undergrads, I teach them as histories of community-based anti-policing movements. I mention this simply to say that it is no coincidence that gay men and trans women, as the populations prosecuted most frequently under anti-sodomy laws, were driven to the piers or the Ramble to meet and work, to make money and seek out friends and lovers. I first read about the Ramble as a young teenager, an era in my life where I was a voracious reader of murder mystery novels, and picked up my mother's copy of Patricia Cornwell's 1995 from Potter's Field. I retrospectively realized that I loved Patricia Cornwell's mysteries, which are all just crystal clear exemplars of literary propaganda, because Kay Scarpetta, the fictional protagonist of 27 books and counting of Cornwell's oeuvre, is clearly a dyke character, even as she's putatively straight. Scarpetta is a striking Italian-American blonde with multiple advanced degrees and impeccable taste in both food and clothing. Everyone wants her, and she lives alone. Well, putatively straight, and Scarpetta was actually based on Dr. Marcella Farinelli Fierro, the first female chief medical examiner for the state of Virginia. Scarpetta is very much a dyke character, perhaps because Cornwell herself is gay. It should thus not surprise any of us that From Potter's Field opens with a murder in the Ramble, a part of New York City more or less synonymous with gay sex. The fictional victim isn't gay, but as a teenager I was transfixed by reading Cornwell's extensive description of this storied cruising ground. This is just to say that it's not just gay people who know that the Ramble is for sex. Even as early as the 1920s, the lawn at the north end of the Ramble was widely referred to by New Yorkers as the fruited plain. Lest you get the impression that it's primarily just these three sets of constituencies whose claims to the Ramble have clashed in messy, uneasy competition, birders, dog owners, queer people cruising, the Ramble is also an area that has historically provided shelter to people experiencing homelessness, from youth with nowhere to go to adults who have found themselves marginalized or ousted by a city social service infrastructure that has systematically cut resources, even as it has severely limited the eligibility criteria for those services that remain. Queer and trans people, people with criminal records, which of course, given the histories of criminalization of both sodomy and dressing in gender nonconforming ways, means that many queer and trans people also do have records. And people who are substance dependent are often barred from accessing shelters and other support services. The New York City park system has been a historic refuge for people with nowhere to sleep, but especially since the 1980s, as the municipal government embarked on a massive plan to beautify, read gentrify, Lower Manhattan, many of the smaller parks, so Washington Square Park, for example, have increasingly implemented what some call anti-homeless measures, including, for example, bars dividing park benches into individual seats to make it difficult or impossible to lie on them. Today, following an uptick in at the start of the pandemic and people who are experiencing homelessness congregating in the northwest corner of Washington Square Park and socializing late into the night, in much the same way it should be noted as the patrons of the dozens of nearby bars, Washington Square Park now closes at 12 a.m. Keep in mind that the surrounding bars close at 4 a.m. and reopens at 6 a.m. How do you close a park? Well, you police it, and the NYPD now cordon off the northwest corner with chained together metal crowd control barriers and patrol the park both day and night. Given this most recent manifestation of municipal hostility towards some of New York's most marginalized residents, it's no wonder then that some of said residents would seek shelter in some of the more remote corners of the city, areas where it's easier to hide and harder to police. All roads lead to the Ramble. Like the frequenting of the Ramble by birders and people looking for sex, New York City residents seeking shelter and a place of refuge from the incursions of municipal governance have found in the Ramble something of a haven since at least the 19th century. While the Ramble became, at least in name, the Ramble as a result of the chartering of Central Park on July 21st, 1853, in the decades before the charter, it and the surrounding areas had been home to Seneca Village. Oops, this is an image of, there's a New York Times article about this person who's experiences homelessness, usually sleeps in and around the park, and makes money by selling drawings of birds to the birders who are congregating around the Ramble. Her name is Lee Rogers. And in classic New York Times fashion, it is like really inappropriately captioned. Here we go. Now we're at Seneca Village. In the decades before the charter, the Ramble and the surrounding areas had been home to Seneca Village, a free black community founded in 1825 that also housed a smattering of Irish and German immigrants. Cynthia Copeland, president of the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History, has detailed how the land that became Seneca Village was purchased by a free black shoeshiner named Andrew Williams in 1825, 2 years before slavery was abolished in New York City. The land would become a haven for more than 200 free black residents of New York who fled the density, disease, and discrimination of Lower Manhattan for a place where they could own property and build community away from the predations of slavery and broader white supremacy. Seneca Village only provided such a haven for so long, however, before it was forcibly dismantled through the legal doctrine of eminent domain, deployed by the city to take residents' land in order to turn it into Central Park in 1857. That was, of course, only the most recent expropriation of the land itself. In 1626, in what some historians have referred to as the $24 swindle, the right to share the Lenape land of Mannahatta was sold to Dutch settlers, although the Dutch settlers themselves claimed that this transaction was not an agreement to share, but a full-on sale. It is unclear whether the Lenape people who brokered the sale even had the authority to do so, but it marked the beginning of a several centuries-long process of land theft and forcible removal that left many of the original native residents of Lenapehoking, a territory that stretches from what's now Connecticut to what's now Pennsylvania, and their descendants relegated to lands west of the Mississippi. Thus, whether known to her or not, when Susie Grunelt, a 15-year-old resident of one of the Upper West Side households that border Central Park, ran away from home in 1897, taking refuge in what was at the time known as the Ramble Cave for a month before being found by police, she was using the park in the same way that communities who came both before and after her did, as a site to elude the surveillance of city governance and her parents, and to make use of this section of Central Park in exactly the way its settler charter described, as a public place. I don't think it's a coincidence that everyday public uses of the park also overlap with putatively illegal uses. And therein lies the rub. Legally public spaces are historically where some of the most marginally legal cultures and practice have flourished. And importantly, that's actually by design. For anyone who's gone to law school, intends to go to law school, or has simply read a lot of John Grisham novels, public streets, sidewalks, and parks are the sites where historically, and to some degree to this day, our fundamental rights to speak, protest, and associate are at their most concentrated. And I think that we're in a really intense moment around some of this stuff right now, and I'm very happy to talk about that afterwards. These are the rights guaranteed protection under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which reads, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But it's not the First Amendment that protects parks and streets so jealously. We'll get there, in American jurisprudence. Rather, it's the common law, laws made by judges deciding cases that have named public spaces as public spaces such as streets and parks as the original traditional public forum, areas that have historically been afforded the highest level of protection as a site for social and political gathering and expression. In the U.S. Supreme Court's holding in Hague versus Committee for Industrial Organization, for example, a 1939 case in which plaintiffs challenged a New Jersey law prohibiting having labor organizing meetings in public streets and parks, the Supreme Court held that, quote, streets and parks have immemorially been held in trust for the use of the public and, time out of mind, have been used for the purposes of assembly, communicating between citizens, and discussing public issues. Like the populist mantra, splashily visualized here by David Horvitz, nobody owns the beach, parks are, too, some of the last spaces that could be called, even if not entirely correctly, public, because also most parks are privately owned. By way of conclusion, even as New York City politicians increasingly criminalize people experiencing homelessness, even as efforts to gentrify or develop urban, suburban, and rural spaces have been broadly coterminous with efforts to further privatize public space, and thus render it vulnerable to greater public regulation, and even as long ago repealed anti-sodomy laws are increasingly replaced by swaths of don't say gay and supposedly anti-grooming legislation, public spaces allow for a complicated entropy of politics and uses that we should fight to protect. As hard as municipal, state, and even federal laws work to quell what some perceive to be unsavory uses of parks and public spaces, those uses do not and will not disappear. When I bird in Edgewood Park, my local birding spot within walking distance of my house, I see friends and community members, and I also see drug sales and people having sex. And that's true. As recently as July, I actually had to ask people who were like having sex literally on this really narrow part of the trail if they would just like move over a little bit so I could walk by them. And they were like really annoyed at me. And I was like, could you just like move like 2 feet? Naturalist organizations, including foundations like the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy, would seek to inculcate birders into their efforts to limit the uses of parks to only those activities with the patina of respectability. Birders share much with the less socially sanctioned users of parks, like people who are there to find, buy, or sell sex, for example. We come and go at dawn and dusk, and often seek out the more remote regions of these natural spaces in which to linger. This could be ground for solidarity, rather than an adversarial posture that, at its core, is driven by the same impulses that drive privatization. In this sense, birders have a special responsibility to resist those invitations to complicity with organizations that are generally well-intentioned relative to birds and animals, but who are frequently significantly less well-intentioned vis-a-vis humans. And we have models for this resistance. And I'm thinking in particular of this moment in 2013. In the week prior to Pride Weekend in San Francisco, a startup tried to sell reservations of space in Dolores Park. The Friday and Saturday prior to Pride in the Bay as elsewhere are the trans marches and the dyke marches, respectively. In San Francisco, on both Friday and Saturday, so many trans and queer people converge on Dolores Park that you can't see the grass for the leather. The startup was responding to what they perceived to be a need, and thus offered a small army of workers who would hold your spot in the park for you on the day of the Trans March and the Dyke March. What the startup did not anticipate, and I'm assuming that this is because the organization was neither led by queer nor trans people, was the absolute hellfire of gay rage that ensued. To try to sell the use of public space on 2 days of political protests that were, at least in part, created specifically in response to the apolitical and heavily consumerist stance of the Sunday Gay Pride March was not just a bridge too far, but an abomination in the order that Jerry Falwell and his brethren have attributed to homosexuality as a whole. The protests were swift and effective. The startup collapsed. The collective rage of a community of queer and trans people over efforts to privatize the use of a public park galvanized the community, multifarious, riven, and contested as it was and as it remains, in less than a week to shut the startup down. This is our obligation as birders, as queer and trans people, as users of public spaces, to participate carefully, thoughtfully, and responsibly in the ongoing cultural litigation of what parks are for. Thank you.
I love this project so much.
Oh,
I mean, you
thanks.
already know that. I mean, you already anticipated that, but also because it combines birds with abolition,
Yeah.
which I think is so great. But I have to start by asking, also because I know the answer is yes.
Yeah.
If you've obviously seen because you mentioned SVU.
Oh God,
and I
yes,
know you
yes.
watch SVU.
Oh yes, yeah.
And you know I've written about SVU and about this episode, but the episode, the Central Park birding.
Yes,
birding
totally.
episode.
I've definitely watched. Yeah, and they were also very fast to produce that episode.
So
I think it was
fast.
out like I want to say within a couple months after. You know what I mean? Yeah, they were like the story writes itself.
Yeah, the first season. I think it was season 22. It was like the first pandemic season of SVU that they shot. The first episode. I mean, it kind of is like this melange of like the Central Park birding incident, but also like the Central Park fire. Like there's so many things going on in that episode. And of course, like it's all, it's of course the idea is like the opposite of the idea of your project, which is that
naturally.
Like, police are needed.
Police are going to help. Yeah, the ramble will be
this-
fixed with police
The
presence.
ramble
Yeah,
will be
exactly.
fixed with like, with compassionate policing. But yeah, but I mean, I guess maybe we could start by talking a little bit about where, I mean, clearly the project originates for you out of your passion for birding, but I also maybe wanted you to connect it with the natural history of sexuality.
Yeah.
Because clearly it's very connected, but like maybe you could say a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like I've been sort of thinking about this. Like, there's a way sometimes, and I don't know if people in this room identify with this, that sometimes you'll start working on a project and really kind of imagine it as distinct from your previous work, and then you're like, oh no, I'm doing the same thing again. And I think I know that I'm not doing the same thing, but I'm doing something in the same vein with this. But I'm not like I'm not quite able to like tightly elaborate the connection. I mean, clearly the politics of space and like the sexuality of space is a big part of it. Like I have another essay in the book about this this book called The Song of the Loon, which is an erotic novel that's like set in Canada, and like the loon part, like looking for loons is a big part of it. And it's this like historians of sexuality are really excited about this piece of like, I mean, it basically is smut. It's like softcore. You know what I mean? It's like, it's kind of like Danielle Steele for like gay men. You know what I mean? And it's about like these men that like meet in nature and have this like raucous, like really kind of Clan of the Cave Bear level of detail narrated sexual affair. And so a lot of the essays in the book are about the way that natural spaces are also these spaces that have historically been used for illicit sexual or forms of sexual practice that are considered illicit or that don't have the sort of social approbation of the world. But I'm also interested in the way that that place shapes practice, and I think I'm still trying to find how that relates to sexuality in terms of the way I'm writing about this book, you know what I mean? But it's interesting to me that I mean certainly you could say that place shapes practice in terms of why the Ramble and the Piers became these two places where where you could go and have gay sex or go and buy and sell or buy or sell gay sex, So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's some of it maybe.
Well, it also, I mean, maybe this is weird, but it also makes me think about, because I was reading the book proposal this morning, and you kind of talk about the sort of sexual binary kind of at work in the way that that birders describe birds, and and sort of the anthropomorphizing of kind of relations between male and female birds, but it also makes me think about animal sex too, and the fact that that is this exceedingly natural thing that takes place in these spaces, and around which birding is occurring in many senses with migration and mating seasons and all of this, and the fact that then the human sex that's often occurring in these spaces is deeply unnatural, deeply pathologized. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, but yeah. I mean, I wanted to also ask, because I'm doing this work on whales that I think kind of intersects with this work on birding, and I'm thinking a lot about stewardship and conservation and the ways that the Save the Whales movement prioritizes this fantasy of cetacean intelligence, and it's really strikingly in contrast to the actual demands of minoritized humans for reparations and for for not just reparations, but for actual aid around environmental racism and climate change. And there's clearly this element of white saviorism here too. And I guess what I'm asking is and you gesture toward this at the end, and maybe I'm moving too fast or too far ahead, but where else do you see this kind of anti-racist abolitionist politics of conservation? I mean, I don't even know actually if it can be a politics of conservation, because conservation itself is such a problematic notion. But what other examples are you looking to?
Well, off the top of my head, and this is kind of basic, but one of the things that was happened in the immediate aftermath of the Central Park birding incident was the creation of Black Birding Week and Black Birders Week, and which Christian Cooper was in part one of the sort of people behind. But it really spread, and this was also the first year of the pandemic, I think, because 2020, I was going to a lot of Zoom seminars about birding, but there was this big Audubon sponsored Black Birders Week sort of series about that was both teaching some of the basics of birding, but not the basics here's how you bring your bins to your forehead. So the rule is you look at the bird and then you lift the binoculars to your eyes, because one of the first things that you learn to do is find the bird in your bins, because it can be really actually difficult to put your binoculars in the right place. But not stuff like that, but basic safety for Black birders. And it was actually sponsored, I'm going to blank on the name of, there's basically a conservancy project. I mean, I don't even know if the people who created it would call it a conservancy project. I want to say it's in Alabama. If anyone wants this reference, I'll look it up and I'll find it, by this Black birder who's in that area, who was I wanted to create a space where Black people could wander and just not be worried about being, yelled at for trespassing. And every person in that, on that Zoom, I don't think Christian Cooper there, but Drew Lanham was there, who wrote a really great book called The Home Place. He's an ornithologist at Clemson University and also a big birder and bird enthusiast. And he also I just need to say this because I just like think he's so cool. He carves. He has a practice, like an art practice of carving wooden sculptures of extinct birds, which I just think is amazing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But he was on the Zoom, if I'm remembering correctly, and you know, every single person in that room was like, oh yeah, like someone threatened to shoot me at some point because I was like walking alone in the woods. And I think like the way that the conversation, I mean, it was really illuminating for me as like a white person who people are like, oh, go bird, you know what I mean? Like the world is your oyster. It was, you know, it was really clear that the sort of conversations that I'd been hearing in the birding community prior to the Central Park birding incident around like a lack of diversity in the birding world, like there was this entire other story about what that lack of diversity derived from. So Black Birding Week would be one. There was another, I just thought of another example that, one of the things that's also interesting is there's like a sort of, both like decolonial, I don't know exactly quite how to describe this, but both Drew Lanham and Christian Cooper have sought to like basically, Drew Lanham wrote a book of poetry about this called Sparrow Envy, and Christian Cooper actually got the name of the New York City Audubon Society changed to remove the name Audubon, both because of colonial and slave like histories of enslaving people. So I mean, those are like, you know, they're not like massive, you know, systemic level interventions, but I do feel like they're very visible, and they're things that, you know, when people are like, should we be saying Kirtland's warbler, or maybe we should use another word to describe this warbler, I think is kind of, I mean, I think it provokes conversations that are really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that also kind of like brings me to another question, because when I asked you that question, I was like thinking more like, I don't know. I guess I was thinking more in terms of like, not what are the actual interventions that are happening, but what are the scholarly interventions that you look to? But like, I mean, you can answer that question if you want to, but you don't need to, because actually I think that like speaks to I don't know if I would say like this is the practice side of theory or whatever, but that like that speaks to like, I think the personal but also practical and political nature of this project for you.
Yeah.
That it's not like about sort of, I mean, intellectualizing, you know, like what interventions could take place in some kind of theoretical sphere, but actually thinking about what is happening.
Yeah.
What are the interventions that are?
And there is, I mean, it's so cliche, it's like a joke, but like about like the reality of the whiteness of conservation movements. You know what I mean? And so I think there is a burgeoning awareness in like broader sections of like, but you know, the Nature Conservancy, sorry, I'm back on like concrete examples, but a friend of mine who I bird with in New Haven named Sophie, they work for the Nature Conservancy, which, you know, they're like, you know, as an ecologist, I really love my job. It's a really interesting job. They're like, but the way the politics of space are like really difficult because, for example, so plovers are, I don't think they're endangered, but they're on the like sort of, I forget what there's the scale towards endangerment. So they're like, they're on the part of the scale towards endangerment you don't want to be on, that we don't want species to be on. And so there's plover nests like all over beaches, like basically on either side of New Haven. And so there's East Haven, West Haven, basically every direction you have a haven. So there's Fairhaven, North Haven, New Haven. So in New Haven, there's not really many places to swim. New Haven, there's like basically one beach that you can go to, and there's like a lot of questions like that the community is sort of has sort of been like pushing at the government about the quality of the water because there's a lot of industry situated in the water over there. So, but when you try, and like again, this was a moment of real real education for me as someone who had moved to New Haven fairly recently. At the point that this happened, I was like, oh, it's a really hot day. I really want to go swimming. I'll just drive over to West Haven. It's like 10 minutes from my house, and I'll just park and go swim in one of the beaches there. So I go and I'm trying to find parking, and all the beach parking lots, they're like residents free. And it's different in different places, so this might be different for Stratford than it is for East Haven. Residents free, non-residents $35, which is like, I mean, that's like a pretty, I mean, for Connecticut, that's a really steep parking fee. And I asked a friend about it, and she was like, oh yeah, she's like, this is like the aura of like white flight, like, you know what I mean? So it was a way of keeping people from New Haven off the beach, because New Haven is about half, it used to be half black, now it's half like people of color with about I think it's a 38% African American population, but it's a city that has been historically since the 18th century had like a lot of Black people, and that's all about what those parking restrictions are.
Yeah.
But on those beaches, or on the New Haven beaches, so like the ones that are closer to us, Lighthouse Point, around the plover habitats, you have people like, they're not police, but they're nature conservancy people who sit there 24 hours a day sometimes to like mark off these areas and ensure that people aren't like stepping on the nests. And my friend Sophie was like, do we really need someone like sitting there? She's,
like they've deputized themselves.
Yeah, they've deputized themselves.
Yeah.
And again, it's not like they can't arrest anyone, but like they can yell at you and make you feel really uncomfortable on a really hot summer day in a city with no public pools.
Right.
You know what I mean? Where like we're the only water source that you can swim in for something close to free is Lighthouse Point,
Yeah. Like also as you're talking, also because I know you, that it's becoming increasingly clear also that this project like is about you getting to know where you actually live.
100%. Yeah. The two places I am the most, New York and New Haven. Yeah.
But also like the New Haven thing, and I guess that sort of, there's part of in the book proposal, there's like a not insubstantial portion of the book is about coming to birding in COVID. And how lots of people did, and how that was sort of, it was even like the subject of sort of joking, right?
Totally.
But I'm just, maybe you could, I just keep asking you to talk more about things. I hope that's okay. But
please.
But maybe you could speak to like the way that COVID not only got you into birding, but also kind of as someone that's constantly moving around. She's literally is never somewhere for like 4 days at a time. Like the way that it kind of taught you about the space. How you came to learn so much about the space, the politics of the space where you live.
If that was actually like weirdly kind of one of the magic parts of COVID, if anything could be said to be a magic part of COVID, is like being forced to be in one place. And mostly when I'm traveling for work. You know what I mean? I'm not like, which is not to say that I'm not traveling. I am, but like, so what I started doing, and I did come to birding as like a regular practice in COVID, but also like my dad died in 2018, and he wasn't a birder in like the way that I'm a birder, but like he was really into birds. Like he always like he and his wife moved into a new house that was all like one floor towards the end of his life, and he was getting really sick. But they weren't clear. They didn't know at that point that he was so sick that he was about to die. And so it was kind of like about accommodations for his mobility stuff. And the first thing, I visited them like right after they moved in, and the first thing that he asked me to do was like refill the feeders, which were on this kind of hill, and he didn't have enough stability really at that point to like stand on a hill. And it was like before I hugged him, he was like I think he had texted me and was like, "Will you refill the feeders?" And like, he had a little bit of like an anxious streak. So like he was like, "Hey, so the feeders are like out back and the seed is over here." And I was like, "Got it. Like, nice to see you. It's been a year." But like, so I think I sort of inherited some of that. Like I remember learning about birds from my dad as a kid. I did grow up, the longest I lived anywhere growing up was in a very rural part of New Hampshire. But it was really nice to be forced to be in one spot. And I started going, I am actually weirdly a creature of routine. And I started going to Lake Wintergreen, which is in Hamden, which is like where I live in New Haven. It's about a 7-minute drive from my house. It's just this loop around the lake. So I would take the dog and I would go birding. And I went to the same place, sometimes twice a day, and birded like basically early in the morning and like kind of as the sun was going down. And you really learn about place, and you're able to like, you're saying, oh wow, like the peewees just showed up, or the peewees just left, or the ovenbirds are here. Like you really get a sense of like the rhythms of, I know it's super nerdy. It's so nerdy. You really get a sense of the rhythms of that. And it was fun because I also met other new birders that way. It was also my introduction to the politics of birding as a whole, which among other things is a knowledge community. And I'm not like, I haven't birded enough places for long enough to know whether this is true of other spots. But I think because it's not Sibley, hold on, or is it Sibley? A lot of big famous birders were Connecticut-based birders. There was one based in Guilford, and it's not Sibley, and I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. This is just my nervousness, I think, manifesting. But there's like a real like old guy rigidity in the birding community, and there's people who I would meet and through the New Haven Bird Club, for example, best $15 membership fee I pay every year. Average age, probably in the 65 to 75. And like I learn a lot from them, but it's also been one of my like clearest encounters with just like old school patriarchy. Do you know what I mean? Like as a, especially as like, a professor at Yale, which theoretically is a social position that like to that particular knowledge community would theoretically mean something. I can tell you it does not. Just like the way that I was like consistently talked down to and told like, I get on these listservs where they'll send you what are called rare bird alerts. So anyone who read Christian Cooper's book, it starts with him getting a notification via a rare bird alert where he like goes racing out of the office to like run into Central Park to try to see this Kirtland's warbler, which are like generally only they're only around in this one like 8 square mile area in Michigan and in the Bahamas. But so I get these rare bird alerts, and so I would go like everyone else to go find the bird, and I'd see someone on the path, and after finding the bird with like a group of birders, and I'd be like, oh, are you looking for whatever it is? Are you looking for the dove key? The dove key controversy in Connecticut was its own thing. But are you looking for the dove key? And people would be like, well, yes. And I'd be like, oh yeah, I saw it. It's back there. And they'd be like, are you sure? And I'd be like, I literally. Like, what are we talking about here? So like that was also like, I mean, that was a long, windy answer, but that was one way.
Well, I think you were telling me I needed to wrap it up. Should we? Yeah, let's open it up. Does who has questions for Greta? Or comments? Questions or comments?
Or your own experiences birding. I love hearing people's birding stories.
Are there any birders in the house? No? Okay.
Oh.
I'll admit I'm not a birder, but I
Yep.
do have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed
Thanks
it.
for coming.
I was really interested in this idea of the sort of cultural litigation of what parks actually form.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that in a lot of the examples that you gave us, you're talking about places like New York, like San Francisco.
Yeah.
I'm also aware, I actually listened to a podcast recently about a person experiencing homelessness in Hampstead Heath in the UK.
Yeah.
But like very wealthy area.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically like built out like a bunker underneath a thistle bush.
Oh, interesting.
And when it was eventually found out, of course, he was arrested for trespassing, but really the issue at hand seemed to be that he was living for free in this space where people pay £8 million for houses.
Oh, I see.
The things that you are talking about today, is this specific to very wealthy cities, or do you think it sort of happens everywhere?
As you were talking, I was like, an example popped right into my head, and then it just popped right away. I think parks, there's a lot of work. I mean, I want to acknowledge like there's immense amount of work on both like state parks. Actually, my colleague He Hobart is working on a second book on state parks in Hawaii right now. So stay tuned for that. But on like national parks, and also the way that national parks were instrumental in indigenous dispossession in the United States. So like lots of work on parks. So and if anyone needs a bibliography, I have a very long one I can send you of other people's excellent work. But yeah, I mean, I think there was just such a good example that I was ready. But I think these are broadly. I mean, I do think these politics like show up in other places. I was in Ypsilanti, which is like it's not New York or San Francisco. It's right outside of Ann Arbor. It's like sort of like Ann Arbor's like, less economically powerful neighbor, but it's increasingly sort of becoming gentrified because people can't afford Ann Arbor. And I was going to a park and birding there. I also, a place where there was also, it was like, it was the season where all the eggs were hatching, and like some of the most aggressive Canada geese I've ever encountered in my life were hanging out there. One in particular who I called Chad, who like tried to chase me out every morning. But like there was someone living in a tent there, and like it was like a lot of people I encountered in the park, including birders, would kind of like talk about it and like seemed upset about it. So I mean, my guess is, and I do go to a lot of parks that are in places that are not major cities. I just happen to live on the East Coast near a bunch of them. But like even in You'll see it even in the, like, come over the, there's like a Connecticut bird list. It's like a listserv. It's also like just a real repository of really boring local drama. That was where the Dove Key incident happened. But like you'll see reports of people like, can you believe that people were doing this in the park? Or like people were littering in the park, or people, you know what I mean? Like there's definitely a sense of like what you should do in a park and what you shouldn't do. And I don't think that's unique to like major urban areas. Again, I'm really disappointed in myself that I had this, like, I was like, oh, here's the example to talk about, and it's gone. So, but thank you for your question. I mean, that's really interesting, because I don't actually see that like I don't see a lot of the rhetoric of like, well, they're just living here for free. I see much more of a like fear-mongering danger rhetoric, at least in the like terms of like the discourse as it sort of hits me here. It's interesting that like the way it would manifest there is like, how dare you, like, you know, Sir John pays $8 million for his thing. You know what I mean? Like, why would you be entitled to your bunker, you know, in the heath? Yeah. So.
I'm also thinking about birding sort of a mental health
Yes.
as well. So in my very limited experience, birding has either been on a silent meditation retreat,
Yeah.
or when I was 18 and amidst some very intense depressive episode, just sitting on a balcony for days.
Yes.
And just looking at birds and that being comforting.
Yes. I think it's extremely comforting. And, you know, everyone who writes about it writes about the comfortingness. Like, I mean, speaking of Christian Cooper again, just because he's sort of the theme of the talk, right at the beginning, it's like right after he describes, at the beginning of the book, the chasing after the Kirtland's warbler, he'll talk about like the way that it asks you to be in a different relationship. Birding as a practice asks you to be in a different relationship to your body and to the area around you. Like it asks you to notice sound. And one of the things that he says, he's like, one of the things he attributes to the sort of comfortingness or calming factor or features of birding is that he's like, you know, birds and humans both, our strongest senses are both ears and eyes. And I was like, and I just thought it was kind of an interesting interspecies moment to think about, like, that being this reason that birds in particular are these like objects of fascination for us, and that, like, you know, it's a meditative practice. It asks you to like stand in a place and like use your eyes and use your, you know, depending on what your sensory availability is, but use whatever senses you have available to you to like perceive what's there. And it's wild, like before I really started birding, I feel like I didn't really see any birds, and now it's like all I can see, you know what I mean? So and I don't think I heard them either, and now it's like all I can hear. So here we are. But yeah, I find it incredibly meditative, and I think one of the other reasons that people got so into it during the pandemic was I think it did have a sort of calming effect in this like incredibly stressful, like, you know, like I feel like we were all just like stewing in our own cortisol for the first like 4 years and counting, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's cute. Hi, it's nice to see you back there. Mhm. Mhm.
So I'm thinking so many different
Mhm.
but I decided that I was just gonna kind of just let it.
Please.
So, you know, one of the things I was wondering about when you were talking, and is actually the issue of psychic reality
Mhm.
and how psychic reality gets mapped on to places.
Yeah.
So that it is certainly an issue of people having competing ideas about the appropriate use
Yes.
of place, or the reason that a place exists, or how one should
Mhm.
relate to it. But I think there's also a way that that sense of its purpose has this like there's a kind of psychic reality
Yes.
that gets mapped onto places, and that produces a certain kind of volatility.
Yeah.
So when you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about was just like, you know, increasingly, you know, as I have my life has shifted class-wise,
Mhm.
and the kind of spaces I
Mhm.
I travel a lot.
Yeah.
And travel across spaces that are
Mhm.
class-wise,
Mhm.
is the thickness of the psychic structures
Mhm.
that organize different places. And I was thinking like one of the places I really
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
inevitably I'm going to get fussed at for
Mhm.
something.
Yep.
And there's something I think that it's not even about the question of improperly using space or not having a shared consensus around what the space is for. There's something about what people psychically
Mhm.
from those spaces and the ways that there are certain kinds of presences that in their very constitution are thought to disrupt
Yes.
kind of psychic work
Mhm.
that those spaces are supposed to
Mhm.
provide. And so maybe it becomes less about behaviors, like behaviors is maybe a misdiagnosis
Yeah.
of like something that is deeper, which
Mhm.
is about kind of like, kind of what psychic structures people assign to
Yeah.
spaces. And, alongside those lines, like, the spaces I was thinking also about like Harlan Weaver's really
Mhm.
important book,
Yes. Yes.
and about how whiteness gets produced in relationship to dogs, whether it's like, extra, ethereal whiteness of the golden retriever,
Yeah.
or yes, I live in Oakland, not San Francisco
Yeah.
whiteness of pit bull.
Yeah. Totally. Totally.
And just the way that in my observation, it's like those kinds of Karen moments, like white people just have that in them,
Mhm.
but the kind of probability and likelihood that those things, the kind of volatility that
Yeah.
makes those moments more likely, maybe, are often these spaces like dog parks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the same people who would, freely deputize themselves in a dark park might be more hesitant to do it in another kind of
Mhm.
space. And so I'm very curious about that. And like, to me, that seems to maybe suggest something psychically
Yeah.
that happens. And then the last thing I'll say is I do not have an attraction to so-called nature for
Mhm.
my leisure time.
Yep.
But one of the things I do notice very starkly is that every single time I fly,
Mhm.
there's a biochemical thing.
Yes. Yes. I know exactly. Yeah.
Flying,
Mhm.
people always use the example of sharing an elevator with
Mhm.
a Black person.
Oh, interesting.
But like flying and the possibility that you might have to sit next to and have and actually touch cross racially
Mhm.
is extremely anxiety inducing.
Yeah.
And like you have the conscription, or not conscription, you have the constriction of space. Plus, then you have all of this like loss of control
Mhm.
over like who you're interacting with and the various kinds of psychic maps that
Mhm.
be around that. And so I just was like listening and just like really struck by like what is happening for people psychically
Yes.
in spaces and like what do they need these spaces for in terms of yeah their biochemistry.
I love that because I think one of the many things I'm hearing in what you just said is also actually something I feel like you just did what Sarah asked me to do at the beginning of this, which is like connect like this or a way of connecting this to some of the like earlier work that I've done, because what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that there's also a way that different spaces activate different like impulses and different reactions is not even quite the right way, but like reactivities, or like there is like a chemical element to it 100%. And I love that. I mean, the dog park is such a good example to think about alongside birding, because it's like, as someone who actually also goes to tons of dog parks, I really like, there's just so many, I'm like, oh my God, that's like that and that's like that. Like, so I'm gonna think about that more. But yeah, I mean, the biochemical stuff and all, I mean, like I want to think about the biochemical stuff, but I love also the idea that public spaces are places where you can't control social entropy, right? Like I think about people, like you're really making me think about people who are like, oh, like I don't want to take the subway. You know what I mean? Like, and cause like, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's what's behind that impulse. It's because you can't control who you're gonna be sitting near. You're also making me think about Claudia Rankine's play Help, which was I think based on that essay that she wrote about sitting next to that white guy on the not the subway, the plane, and they had this like really wonderful interaction until she said something about like, I don't know, like something, she said, like, I think she describes it, I believe, as bland. She said something bland about like DIA politics or something. And he's like, whoa, hey now. And physically recoils from her. Yeah, this is just, I mean, yeah, I feel like you just gave me like 8 more vectors to sort of think with as I revise this essay. And I love thinking about what's different spaces activate, because I think that's so important. I think we see that everywhere. And I think not only in terms of what different spaces activate when you're actually there, but also what the idea of certain spaces activate in people that keep them out or draw them in, you know? Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Well, and you also mentioned cortisol, right?
Yeah, right,
Like
yeah.
as something that, you know, would be soothed by birding, but it's easy to see how that would also not be the case.
Well, I'm sure that Christian Cooper was not, you know what I mean? Like
Exactly. But I think we're out of time. So can we thank Greta? Thank you, Greta.
Thank you all. And thanks, and Sarah too.